So we're here to talk about the ACT, and just this poll will close momentarily, but we're talking about the ACT as compared to SAT, but also just as a college entrance exam. And what I'm going to tell you today is probably a little bit more than you need to know about the ACT. I'm coming from the perspective of someone who's worked for Applerouth, this tutoring company, for about 10 years in a few different capacities. I've taught public school classes, I've managed tutors, and now I just tutor full-time online. And my specialty is PSAT, SAT, and ACT. So this is my bread and butter, but I assume there will be questions that come up. We're going to try to cover this from all angles. And my goal is to make this worthwhile. I'll get you out of here in under an hour. And at the end, we will just answer any questions you guys may have. Closed captioning should be available. We've also got someone behind the scenes troubleshooting. So again, just throw anything into the Q&A if need be. So here's what we're going to be looking at very, very briefly. Never fear, the history of the ACT. Just one slide. We're going to get a lot into the content tested, so what you can expect to see on the ACT, and then very important to think about a testing plan, timeline, studying, when do you register. So we're going to get into all of that. Brief history, as I said, the SAT came first. It was originally the, I believe, Scholastic Aptitude Test or Standardized Assessment Test, and had different acronyms. Now it's just the SAT, just like the ACT is just the ACT. They don't stand for anything. But in 1926, the SAT started out east in Princeton, New Jersey, got popular as a way to standardize scores. It's a curved test that can help you see, even if someone's GPA is 3 at one school, 3 at another, and that's not comparable, a test score can be curved. You can compare those two applicants. Then in 1959, some competition arose with the ACT. And for a long, long time on the coast, it was really SAT country. And then the Midwest was ACT. So growing up in Illinois, I was required to take the ACT, whereas people from New York really came in not knowing what an ACT was. So I had students who came from New York and only knew SAT. These days, here's what's important for our purposes, is the SAT and ACT are universally accepted. Here's what I mean. Every college that accepts standardized test scores will accept either SAT or ACT, and there is not a preference. So if a student or family would ask, what's better, should I take the SAT or ACT? It's really a decision based on taking baseline mock tests and deciding which one you're stronger at, which one do you like better, and where were the scores higher. And we're going to talk today about how to interpret the results of a mock ACT, for example, and really dig into where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses, and is this the test for me? But very important to know that SAT and ACT are equivalent, universally accepted, and also important to remember that this is one piece of the puzzle. This is not the whole picture. So yes, test scores are a very important part of college admissions. You can see from this NACAC survey done a few years ago, it's one of several things, and grades still take precedence in what classes you're taking, and extracurriculars are important. And now that the SAT and ACT are doing away with the writing portions, for the most part, the personal statements we have are really, really important. So just remember, test scores don't define us. Yes, they can help an application, or they can hurt with a poor score, but it's just one piece. So it's not the whole ball game. It's just a part of it. It's a big part. Some key differences between these two tests. I'm going to leave it on this slide for a little bit because there's a lot here. You can see some definite similarities. 4 sections apiece. The English and the writing sections are very similar. The biggest difference is that ACT is very fast paced. So if I was breaking it down into its simplest terms, the SAT is more analytical and you get a bit more time, but it's just harder. It's just a harder test. You need to know a lot about a little. The ACT is easier, just simpler. They don't hide the ball. You need to know a little bit about a lot. So whereas the SAT wants you to know everything about factoring and parabolas, the ACT might just say, hey, have you ever heard of a logarithm? If so, here's a point. Or have you ever heard of a matrix? Here's another point. The other big difference in ACT is there's a standalone science section, and I put science in quotes. We'll talk about it later, but it's not really science. It's kind of the graphs you'll see on the reading and writing sections of SAT where you're really matching answer choices to graphs and tables more than anything else. So it's a data analysis section. There isn't a one-size-fits-all rule on which test you should take, but if there was one, I would say the best indicator is if someone is very strong in math, but a little bit weaker in the verbal, often the ACT is a better test, just because even though the reading and English are fast-paced, they're simpler. You're not going to have advanced passages like you do on SAT. So you can see their average amount of time per question. And overall, this test take about the same amount of time, but some clear differences throughout, which we're going to get into. Here they break down the actual time per question. So you can see the percent difference. It's pretty significant, about 1/3 more time on each section per question. So for example, on math, there's 60 questions in 60 minutes for the ACT. That's a lot, right? It's hard to get to all of those. The SAT only has a total of 58 questions, so fewer than the ACT. And instead of an hour, you actually get a total of, across 2 sections, you get an hour 20. So it is pretty significant. And again, ACT simpler, but faster paced. We're going to talk about the reading sections a little bit here. And the SAT passages aren't listed in order from 1 through 5, how they go on the test, but the ACT ones down there in orange are. Every single reading section will start with prose and fiction, and then it'll be a social science passage, and then humanities, and then natural science. That's great because if you're super strong with 2 types, even if it's passages 2 and 4, you can start with those. Maybe give yourself some momentum, answer some questions quickly and confidently and correctly, and then get into the harder passages. What you'll see on the SAT is that, and actually I would maybe tweak this a bit. So 1 humanities, but really the other way to refer to these is social science, which you do see on ACT, but this one's more like the 5th one is more like politics and history. And that's what most of my students find difficult, even if they're in AP US history. So they're juniors when they're taking the test and they're in US history class. Sometimes it's almost not a blessing, but a curse, because then they delve too deeply. So a lot of SAT reading is just about staying on the surface, which is hard to do. On the ACT, it's easier to stay on the surface because we don't have time for anything else. And the questions are very matching. As this page points out, the ACT is also more consistent, so you can expect fairly similar difficulty level on each passage type, whereas you'll see the politics and usually literature passage are some of the toughest ones on SAT. A little bit about SAT versus ACT math, and then we'll get deeper into the actual math content of ACT specifically. But again, more even distribution. So on the SAT, it's pretty heavily skewed towards algebra. It's again, polynomials, parabolas, factoring, foiling, intercepts, all these things that if I have students or rising juniors in this presentation are probably thinking, oh my God, all that stuff that I learned in algebra 1 and 2, and have probably even since forgotten. SAT gives you geometry formulas and then doesn't test it very much. ACT doesn't give you formulas, but tests it a lot. So you can see that 23% on geometry is really significant. And I do find we work a lot on that because people usually take that in 9th grade. So by the time they're getting to the standardized tests, they've forgotten a lot of it. And some of the hardest questions are this stuff, arithmetic, missing an I there, but absolute value, inequalities, and percents, and things that we just haven't dealt with much. And then both tests will deal with trig, but ACT tests basics, SOHCAHTOA, and trigonometry quite a bit more than SAT. But I think this is a pretty fair breakdown of the content of the 2 math sections. Getting into the ACT specifically. So I think actually I'll go back 1 second. Here's where you start. So most students, when they are thinking about test prep for the first time, could be somewhere after 10th grade, could be earlier, although it wouldn't go much earlier than summer after 10th grade. But oftentimes people are starting fall of junior year or spring of junior year, or even summer before senior year. No matter when you start, the first thing to do is decide on a test. And the way to do that is take baseline mock tests. Applerouth offers them for free at very low rates throughout the year on weekends, both online and in person. You can also easily download a free copy of an ACT or SAT online, print it and take a mock test on your own time. The key is you want a baseline score for each test. And more than a score, we'd love to have detailed results, because my first session with a student is pretty much always going to be, let's work on the baseline mock test for whichever test we're pursuing. So if we're going ACT, we're going to look at your ACT first mock and then find patterns, identify what we're going to focus on. It's very important to have that. And what we'll go through on the next several slides is Applerouth example of what does it look like when you take a mock test and then these results pop up on your account, so that both your tutor or just you and your family, if you don't have a tutor, could see. Let's start with the basics. SAT's out of 1600, ACT's out of 36, which is super different. It is an average of 4 section scores. So you add English, math, reading, science, divide by 4, and then rounding up. So if you divide it and you get a 19.5, that's a 20. But a 19.25, that's a 19. This score of a 20, so I have people ask me, what's a good score? That's impossible to answer. It depends on you and your score goals and just where we're at to start and how hard we're willing to work. But I will say 20 is about the national average still. So above a 20, we're feeling good. And a lot of times people are starting in mid 20s and want to get to a 30. So it really just depends on what's our starting level and where are we trying to get to. Just looking at the overall breakdown can tell us a lot. Like here I'm seeing I would like to get math up to the other levels. Because it's 16, we're probably missing a lot of the 60 questions. So that might mean let's focus on the first 20. They're traditionally the easiest. Let's make sure we nail the first 20 or 30. And even if you have to guess all the way down in the next 30, your score would still go up. So there's little test taking strategies like that that can help a lot, showing where you're at on the test. Yeah, I would say focusing on English and math first for this student. Speaking of which, a little bit more detail, we're gonna get even more in a second, but you can see on English here, this person missed 24 questions. So 51 correct out of 75, that's 68%. And that cost them 13 out of 36 points. So 24 misses cost us 13 points. That's not a point per question, but you could see if someone could knock out 4 of those and maybe get 55 correct, the score would probably go up to a 25. So each test is graded on a different curve, but they're all fairly similar. You lose points rapidly at the very top of the curve. And in the middle, you might have to miss a few questions to go down by 1 point. This math score of a 26 is actually quite solid, 39 out of 60, missing only 21. So it's about, let's figure out, are we getting all the early ones and prioritizing easy points? And then if we have to run out of time and guess on the toughest stuff, that's okay. We don't mind that. And so just in terms of what they're testing, English is going to be grammar and rhetoric. We'll talk about that a bit more. And then math really does test basic rules. And again, just do you know anything about this? Have you seen it and do you recall it at all? You are also allowed to have your calculator the whole time on the ACT math section, which is a big benefit, including TI-84s, TI-Inspires, all these really heavy duty calculators that can do a ton of stuff. And you're now allowed to have them. The second 2 sections are what I call the time crunch sections. And I find that these are by far the tougher ones to bring up in general. And they also are just the most challenging and in that sense, the most interesting to teach, because everyone's different with reading. Some people benefit from looking at the questions a little bit first. That's not that typical, but some people do. Others need to read and take notes and practice how to do that. So the reading, as you might expect, is about comprehension, but also eliminating answers and thinking like the writers. And the science section that we talked about is more data analysis. You have to use common sense occasionally and think like scientists, but not very often. The key point on this page is that when you practice these, it's not about like going back through old questions that you've done. So like for English math, one of the first things you do is let's look at the 24 English and 21 math questions you missed and let's fix them. So that you, the student, if you see them again, you can confidently say, I know what to do, right? That's what a tutor is supposed to instill is, I can get this next time, because these tests are repetitive. Reading and science, that is not as helpful. Not only will you not remember the reading passage or science passage that well, even if it was 2 days prior, but it's also just very painstaking. And usually the issues are not about understanding or knowledge of content. It's often pacing or just strategy or timing. So when you practice reading, you want to practice with full passages or ideally full test sections, but a reading passage at under 9 minutes per passage. Got to figure out where I'm losing time. For science, the rule is 7 questions means you get 6 minutes. 6 questions means you get 5. So it's those two sections are really about time-based practice, and that's the grind on ACT. Those are the tough ones to bring up. Let's talk stats about the English section. So 75 questions in 45 minutes. That's pretty fast paced, but not anything too crazy. I don't have that many people having time issues on this particular section. Of course, students with IEPs or 504 plans or who need accommodations in school can apply for test accommodations. The ACT grants them on a test by test basis, but the most common one would be extended time, which is time and a half. So obviously some people really need that, and that extra 20, 25 minutes on this section can make a ton of difference. What are they testing? So it's 5 passages, 15 questions apiece, some grammar, some rhetoric, which you'll see down here. And for most people, you don't want to read the passage. You kind of want to go questions to passage. So just looking at question 1, what are they testing? All right, let me apply my rules. And same with question 2 and so on. The grammar you can expect to be tested: punctuation, parallelism, possession, verb tense, subject-verb agreement, modifiers. There's not that many. It's about 10 or 12 grammar topics total, so very much conquerable. Rhetoric, there's about 5 topics. So you can see your add, delete, order placement. You see on question 21 on this report, accomplish a task, super common question type. But if you're reviewing this and this is your mock result, the thing that should probably jump out is I missed 3 comma questions in a row. And that's very typical because we haven't thought much about commas. We don't often use them correctly. Students tend to overuse them in their writing. And so thinking about what do commas do and talking about clauses can make a big difference. And maybe we won't get all 3 of those every time, but we won't miss all 3. And the abbreviation is CSE for Conventions of Standard English. That's just something you see on the mock and report and don't pay much attention to. Let's talk grammar. So you can see on the right side a passage in 5 questions, all of which are grammar questions. And I think we have time to even look at some of these, but take a look on the left-hand side of what types of questions we might see. And then what I would encourage test takers to do is when evaluating question 1, you're going to look at what's underlined and the 3 choices to decide what are they testing. Here you've got their versus their, he or she, they. So that looks like pronoun use. And the Applerouth has great online materials. We have a great book that would break down pronouns and I versus me and who versus whom. In this case, though, it's about eliminating. So if we know that that's not the right there, wherever they're going, no. Or wherever they are go, probably doesn't sound good either. And then at this point, he or she is not going to be a correct answer on this test. They go makes sense because it's most people. It's the subject replaced by they. Oftentimes, it's as simple as that. Number 4 is also a pronoun question because you see it, they, their, and lifi. And in that case, someone who's had test prep with a tutor who knows their stuff would know this is going to be my answer right off the bat, because if there's pronoun, 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 and a noun, the noun's pretty much always right. The writers are telling you it's unclear. The only thing that often people overlook, or one thing they often overlook, is the title. So when you do get rhetorical questions later, because we haven't read and we're just kind of jumping from question to passage and back, that's where if you have a question that asks you, the writer is trying to accomplish this task, did they? That's when you would go back and read a little bit. So it's all about finding your comfort zone, getting through this quickly, confidently, crisply, and on occasion you'll have to skip questions just because we don't like them. They just feel challenging. There are no points off for wrong answers though, so if you skip a question, do bubble something in and just make sure you come back. I'm a big proponent of doing everything in your test booklet first and then transferring it over to the Scantron. Nobody's going to see the test booklet unless there's something happens with like someone's accused of cheating or the test center, something weird happened. So that test booklet's just for you, and you should be writing in it and really marking it up on every section. Here's rhetoric, and right off the bat, we can tell how it looks different, right? I know a rhetoric question because it has a question. The first part is boilerplate, given that all choices are true. The second part is our job. And this is almost like the ACT science section when you see these. We want figurative language to develop ideas from the preceding sentence. So this is where we're looking. Preceding means before. And so that would be this sentence right here. Right off the bat, if people know that, they're going to be in good shape, right? What you don't want to do is answer this thinking whatever sounds best or just I like this answer. We have this process of, all right, I'm a robot. I'm doing the job the writers asked me to do. And so what are the ideas in the preceding sentence? So it looks like someone is being denied warm clothes and blankets and a fire because they wanted to get her to go to bed early. It's a young woman. And so the question is, which answer choice talks about a young woman and like fire or warmth or something? C is the worst answer because it doesn't mention a woman at all. A says her passion and extinguished, got to keep it. B says she continued to learn as she grew up. Well, that's about her. And then D is kind of similar. But if you look at it, it says, despite these efforts, kept reading many books. So that really doesn't make much sense. We need a noun or a pronoun. Between the two remaining, that's when you go back and think, all right, what is here? And what I think they're trying to do is figurative language of extinguished because they're talking about passion, but alluding to the word fire. So B is not terrible, but A is a better match. That question is much more involved than a grammar question, but it can also be one of the easier ones we see once we have a strategy and we just know we're robots, we're just going to match. So the most common advice I'm giving test takers here is don't overthink, don't work too hard, which is not necessarily good life lessons, but for the ACT, it really is helpful. Stay on the surface when you can. There's always a simple solution. Closing out the English section with some tips. So look for patterns. That means if you have taken a mock test or some sort of practice, evaluate it, right? I see a lot of students who are taking test after test after test, but they're not using it. They're just looking at their score and hoping it goes up. The most crucial and valuable thing you can use on the ACT is mistakes you've made on practice or in session. So it's just so valuable. Make sure that you look for patterns. Maybe you're missing a bunch of comma questions, and then we know we got to focus on that. Maybe we're missing rhetoric. So it's just, I just probably need more context or a different strategy. But there's definitely identifiable patterns on almost every mock report in one way or another. If you have questions about English, make sure you put them in the Q&A. We'll get to them at the end. Let's talk math, section 2 of the ACT. And an interesting one because some people really like it and excel at it and like the fast-paced, easy nature. Others, let's say you had one bad teacher, one class that you just didn't connect with, and maybe that was geometry. That can be a big gap. You can see here on the first 13 questions, 5 of them were geometry on this particular test. They get progressively more difficult, so that traditionally the first 20 are easy, 21 through 40 medium, 41 through 60 hard, but there's overlap, and what one person finds difficult, another might not. You can use your calculator for the full section, and you should. And the only other weird thing here is that there are 5 choices, not 4. That's the only section on any test, SAT or ACT, that has 5 choices. The skills. So what do we need to know? We've got to know some arithmetic, which includes stuff like I mentioned earlier, absolute value inequalities, but also ratios, proportions. Algebra, not as heavy as SAT, but definitely need to know the lines y equals mx plus b and forms of parabolas, probably need to review. Geometry is the big one. Spent a lot of time on triangle rules and basic geometry rules on just shapes and circles and angles. And then perimeter area and volume, of course. So that's from anything from a square to a rectangle to a trapezoid to a rhombus. There's all sorts of little rules that people often need to refresh. And then trigonometry, we also mentioned earlier. Many students will be coming off of a long unit circle unit in math. And so they'll be making things too hard when they see radians or they see a function and they want to make it calculus-y. So a lot of this is just understanding the ACT is simple. Most stuff is really straightforward, basic SOHCAHTOA rather than advanced trig or trig identities. I have a question about merit scholars. I'll definitely talk a little bit about that at the end. Yeah, that's having to do with PSAT, but we'll definitely talk a bit about that. Math section here. So this would be a nice breakdown you'd see from a mock test. This is just what it looks like on our page. You'd first see what we saw on the last page of questions we got right and wrong. And then here it breaks down what types. So it's tougher on ACT because there's just so much stuff. Properties of numbers looks like something here that I would probably go into. That's about like what are prime numbers or integers and different vocab that we haven't thought about in forever. Other than that, I mean, I see most of the questions missed here are late, which is a good sign. That means they're challenging. So even though there are 7 arithmetic, because these are almost all towards the end, I'd expect people to miss those questions unless they're really math whizzes. But you can obviously get a ton out of this and just think about not only what question types I'm missing, but go in and look at that actual question, section 2, question 42, and either on your own or with the help of internet or a book or a tutor, you can figure out how to do that question if you see it the next time. And even with 60 questions, there's a ton of repetition on these tests. To dig a little bit deeper into the math section, here's a couple of samples. And it really is a grab bag. This would be from the middle end. So I'll leave this up for just a moment for you guys to look at it. And we'll go ahead and solve them. So a lot of test prep is a little bit like teaching for another test. I mean, these tests are very different than a normal test, as in you can't study the night before. You have to really kind of build a knowledge. It's not formulas. It's just about the test itself, knowing how it works. So like circling what you're solving for is important, the area of this figure. And then we might look at this figure and think, well, I don't know what this is. Anytime you see a shape that's a bit ugly or you don't like it, you break it up. Then from there, we should be able to figure out what's left. So 40 here, 24 there means I'm left with 16 right here. And then you could find the area of both of these and add them together. Right, so always a simple method. There is no formula for Utah shaped or state shapes shape like this. So we break it up. It's almost always going to be broken up into right triangles and or rectangles. In this case, if you drew a triangle, you would then realize, well, crap, that didn't really help me because I still got this weird half arrow shape. For 42, the most common mistake would be not seeing the word not. A lot of people just gloss over not because we're so used to finding the right answer. But this is a question where you should just plug in. We can distribute the 8 and the 2 just like we would in normal algebra. And then we can really treat this like an equation. So maybe we don't need to plug in 8x plus 24 is greater than, distribute the 2 to get 2x minus 6. And then if you combine like terms, subtract 2x from both sides, subtract 24 from both sides, and then we divide both sides by 6. The weird thing here is that we don't flip the sign because we didn't divide by a negative. That's the only time you would flip that sign. That's a pretty obscure old rule a lot of people will remember. X is greater than -5. F is our answer because all those other choices are greater than -5, but F is not because there is no or equals to sign there. Again, the other thing you could do here is you could just plug in the -5 or the answer choices into each spot to see which one gives you an untrue inequality. Chances are that at least one of those 2 questions gave you some confusion. That's why test prep is important. You got to get to know it, know what to expect. But it's just so different. I mean, from geometry and then right away to this thing is kind of strange. So just a lot of variability on this test. Word problems, there are a lot on the ACT. They're shorter though than the SAT, and I think less tricky. Like SAT words things very strangely, intentionally. On the ACT, you're more likely to have a picture. You will not get the formulas though. So memorizing stuff like Pythagorean theorem and special right triangles and SOHCAHTOA would be important. In this case, TOA, tangent of A, would be opposite over adjacent, which is A over B. So answer choice A for this one. And again, that's about the most basic trigonometry we could do, but many people will have forgotten that or just not remember to write out SOHCAHTOA for themselves on the test. Some tips for this section before we move on. Look for patterns, always look for patterns. If you're missing a bunch of early answers, it's probably careless errors, although it's often just content knowledge gaps. So like it could just be, oh, this person needs geometry review because they didn't remember there's 180 degrees in a triangle. If you find a lot of omits, which you never want to see at the end, or guesses, that could be fatigue. It could be, I didn't know it was getting harder as it went. But honestly, I would like to see, for most people, guesses at the end. I want to see for the last 10 questions, EK, 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 not only because they often pick the last choice for those last 10, but also because you don't want to Christmas tree it and guess A, B, C, D, and all the way down. You're not going to get every one of those last 10 right, but you're going to get more than most people because most people will miss them all. But if you can get 2 or 3 out of 10 just on a lucky day and spend time on the 45 or 50 questions you know you can nail, that is often the ticket to the highest math score you can get. And one common error we see is just errors in translation, translating words into math and modeling, something we'll see a lot. All right, we're doing great on time. Let's talk reading. So for this one, it's again the first big time crunch passage. It is 35 minutes for 40 questions. 4 passages, 10 questions each means you get 8:45 per passage. So 8 minutes, 45 seconds on average to read a passage and answer 10 questions. That's hard, no matter how easy the questions are. Skills tested are reading comprehension, making inferences, but not too many, because it's usually on the surface, and then interpreting vocab and context. There are harder question types on the SAT that don't appear on the ACT, just like there are harder passage types on the SAT as well. The order is always the same: literature first, then social science, then humanities, then natural science. You do not have to do them in order. And one of the 4 will be a comparison passage. We don't know which one it'll be, but there's a slightly different strategy for those. So a lot of this is going to be about a test taker kind of taking control of their own fate on this test in their own process and deciding, I'm not going to do this first passage first because I always go too slowly. Even if I like it, it's just I immerse myself, I go too slowly. I'm going to go do the science ones first. That type of technique is usually pays off super well because not only are we taking ownership, but also we're doing the easy stuff first, building momentum and confidence. The comparison passage that I mentioned. So this is what the questions will look like. Although sometimes these days on the real tests, they don't have this box. So you'll just have to understand that 1, 2, and 3 deal with parts of passage A. The only difference for this passage type is you want to read passage A first. And then instead of doing what we would normally do, which is read passage B, first do questions about passage A. So in this case, questions 1 through 3. Then read passage B. And then do questions, it looks like 4 through 7. And then finally, we'll do the comparison ones, which are often kind of tricky. The reason behind this is twofold. One is you're keeping less information in your mind at once. The second is questions 1, 2, and 3 will have traps that are laid that will only trick you if you've read passage B. So if you haven't read passage B, you're going to avoid the traps the writer set for you. So always just go one at a time. I want to make just another couple quick points about reading. So the reason I say it's the hardest thing to tutor and one of the harder scores to raise is because a lot of times it just takes trial and error. If we're running low on time, which almost everybody is, we have to figure out what's our move. Is it to skip one passage type? Is it to strategically skip 1 or 2 questions per passage? Is it to maybe glance at the questions first? Is it to change my strategy of note-taking or underlining? Should I be like reading the first part and the last part of the passage, then going to questions? And I can say, I mean, I've worked with thousands of students and there's been no 2 students who have the same process. There have been similarities and certain things that work for most people, but this one, it really takes up a lot of thought. Probably the number 1 strategy you would learn with good test prep would be how to take simple notes. And the second would be how to eliminate bad answers. because if you're thinking like the test writer, they write a question and a correct answer. That's how you write a test. Then 3 choices literally meant to fool people like you and me. So if we can find the bad answers and the words that make them wrong, that kind of games the system. That's really the tack to take on reading. And that would be the method I would use if I was taking the test these days. Let's talk science. So the last section, 35 minutes, 44 questions. So actually, I think it's just 40. I believe they've changed that. So we can just put that as 40. It's also multiple passages, 6, not 4, but they're shorter. And the real thing to know here is 5 of them are normal, and then 1 of them is called a dueling scientist passage. So 5 of the passages are matchy graphs mostly and matching the answer choices. And then 1 is more like a reading passage. We don't know where it'll be. We just know it's going to be somewhere. It's pretty easy to spot because it has no graphs. So we'll talk about that in a minute. A lot of people would want to do that one first or last. So if you're coming off reading section thinking, I did well, I like reading, I'm in reading mode, go find this one, do it first. If you come out of section 3 thinking, oh gosh, that was tough, I ran out of time, I need a break, I need to just match some data, then do this one last. If you run out of time on it, it was probably the hardest thing for you anyway. So you always want to be guessing on the hardest thing for you if we do run out of time. I'll say it again, if you do run out of time, you always want to save the hardest thing for last so that you're getting the easy points. Skills tested, I mean, really graph reading. So finding a point, comparing 2 points, you see those here. Trend spotting, of course, a big one. And then rarely scientific method. So also knowing vocab, independent, dependent variables, control. And then sometimes you have to actually think like a scientist. So if you don't have any matches anywhere, then we use common sense and think, oh yes, a dry paper towel is stronger than a wet paper towel, or little inferences like that. Or cars will work harder in the extreme cold than they would in summer weather. So little things that most people can logically infer without thinking too hard. We're like 5th grade scientists. And we're going to talk about this for a while because it is the biggest difference. It's not like anything on the SAT, aside from a couple of things sprinkled into the reading and verbal writing sections. But the reading has no science section at all. So the deal is you got to move quickly. Take a look just kind of like what you might have here. This is no question. This is just the passage and graphs. And if they say 40 questions, 35 minutes, your time starts now, and you flip open here, most people's gut reaction is going to be, well, let me read this thing and figure out what's going on. But that's actually not the right move. At best, you should skim it. Usually we want to skip past the passage and use the question, use the choices to match back. You'll read through this a little bit as you go, but we don't have time to really try to understand and read through the passage. We just don't have time. You can see here, most questions will say according to figure 2, or based on table 1, or sometimes according to the information provided, which usually means passage. You can see all those patterns in questions. This would be 1 of 6 passages here. And the passages can really have any kind of diagrams or charts or graphs or tables. Speed's important. We talked about the dueling scientist passage already, so that's what you see on the left-hand side. This would just be another example. So like back here, you had something about, looks like what, chlorophyll and bacteria, so biology stuff. And then here, we've got more chemistry. We've got some stuff about pH level and chemical structure. So for this one, the outside knowledge that you would have to do really well is that the neutral pH is 7. So water has a pH of 7. Any lower than that is more acidic, any higher is more basic. A lot of people won't remember that from chemistry. So those are the little things to just kind of refresh before doing a science section. pH, chlorophyll, Punnett squares, little things you just haven't thought of in a very long time. Periodic table stuff, like atomic number. They don't get very deep into it. So I don't want people to think this is sciencey. It's mostly matching. Well, for the last, but arguably most important time today, look for patterns. If we have omits or guesses, maybe we're spending too much time on the passage. We're not getting to everything. And then again, that means a couple things. Either it means you need to skip a passage strategically because it's the hardest one for you. Oh, physics, I'm not doing that one. Or what I like is for each passage, there's usually a question or two that's super hard. If we can convince ourselves to not be perfectionists and just grab easy points and move past anything that's tough. So anytime you hit a little bit of wall, just kind of cruise past it and come back. That's generally the best way to prioritize easy points and get as many of them as possible. We're understanding science fluency, not real science. You should not have to think scientifically very much at all. So I want to open it up for questions. First, let's talk a little bit about just the basics of planning this out, because I know that can be overwhelming. So I first want to say it's okay. I mean, no matter where you're at, there are tests you can take. This is a very stressful process. I think my biggest goal as a tutor is to make it not that way. Of course, open up opportunities and get the highest score we can get. And we have similar goals that way, but it can be a very stressful process, adding to a pretty stressful time. I mean, junior year in particular for high schoolers, I was just telling the person who's proctoring the presentation, I was just telling them that my students now, as opposed to 3 weeks ago, are actually rested. They're actually getting sleep. It's amazing, which is one reason why test prep is great to do in the summer and summer tests. But I just know that this can be one more thing to add that can be really frustrating, really annoying, especially if you don't get the score you want when you wanted it. So just know that you're not alone in that. The way to register for a test, and you should do a couple, is act.org. Here's some test dates. There's actually one this Saturday, of course, which you would have already had to register for. But if you're a rising junior or senior, the next test date you could take is September. Last I checked, it wasn't actually open for registration yet, but I would imagine that's going to open up very, very soon, like within probably the next week or so. So keep checking act.org if you're trying to register for September. And ultimately, let me see if we mention this here. You can see September, October, December, February, April, June, July. That's every year. One little note is that there are 3 tests every year where you can actually get the test back. I can't remember. I think actually maybe December, April, June, December each year. So the only way that comes into play is if somebody was getting ready to take their first test around April of 2023, and the second test, hopefully the last one in June, you can order the test information release is what it's called for April, and we would get that back just before the June test, usually late May. Then you can actually work through every question that you missed before the next test. So it's about the best resource you could have. I do usually recommend registering for a couple back-to-back tests, 2 or 3, because it's very rare someone can be one and done. It does happen. We'll talk about why should we do more than one test. So of course, everyone's different, but for most people, 3rd time's the charm. I have many students who've done it in 2, for sure, but just rare to get it in 1 test for a lot of reasons, right? We're anxious. We haven't had that testing experience. We're just doing it for the first time, and so haven't had as much experience usually and have more practice to do. So most students with Applerouth, I would definitely expect a solid jump from your first official test to the second one, definitely. And then again, if people take it a 3rd time, that's often the one that just like, man, I really nailed each part of it. So ideal world, you register for 3 official tests, and that really helps the nerves on the first one, because you just know, I'm not trying to just get my score, like this is my one chance. Instead, you're thinking, I've got multiple cracks at this, I've got time, and this test, while it matters and of course is important, it can lower the stress of it if you know you've got more down the road that you can take. I mean, this is huge. So super scoring, which I do get a lot of questions about, just what is it? Best way I can explain it, I think, is just write out a couple of scores. So let's say that we have English, math, reading, and science. And let's say the first time you take it, you get a 23, and then a 24, 5, so solid score, composite right around a 24. And the second time we take it, we actually go down in reading, down in math, but then up in sorry, down in English, down in math, up in reading, up in science. The way super scoring works, and especially with the ACT now, you don't even have to do it, they do it for you. Schools that super score, which is over half, will only see your highest section scores. They won't even know how many times you took it. So your new composite is those 4 numbers added up divided by 4. And then you can take it a 3rd time, and let's say you only go up on English, but the other ones go down. Then this is the one that you would send, and this 23 goes away. So super scoring is crucial, more so for ACT than SAT. I'm imagining we'll have some questions about that, so I can flesh that out more. But again, you're going to gain confidence in yourself through more testing. You want to spread out goals. I never will tell someone, hey, just focus on English. ACT has promised that they will offer individual sections, but I don't know when that's going to happen, so we can't plan on it. So we always have to prep for all 4, sometimes put more of an emphasis on, let's say, science if you need to raise that. But it definitely helps to have 2 or 3 tests to get that goal. Again, we're okay. If you haven't started yet, it's okay. Even if you're a rising senior, you've got time to take it. I mean, especially like September, October, even December for regular decision applications are totally fine. The scores come back usually within 10 days. To report scores, you can, I believe, do some for free on the ACT website when you register for a test. But if you're not comfortable with that, it doesn't cost that much to send them later. You can actually complete an entire college application and then just supplement with the test score whenever it comes in, right? A lot of people do that knowing I've got this decent, it's pretty good score, but I'm taking it one more time and maybe do better. And then as soon as those ACT scores come back, if your super score went up, you can then report those to the school. College counselors are good people to talk about that, of course. And I know that college applications is a big thing, but just giving a bit of insight on that score reporting, because I've had questions about it. Again, what's right for you? This is what I work on with my students all the time, because it's really about when taking a test, which one did you like better when you take the baseline test? Because if the scores are pretty comparable, always go with the one you enjoyed more. We'll always do better with what we like. But the other thing to consider is, well, what if ACT is in July and I have this tournament in July, and it's just going to be crazy then, versus the SAT in June and August I could do. So those are really things to keep in mind. You don't want to be studying or taking a test during your busy season. So many people took it in May and didn't do great. The May SAT, it happens every year because AP season is just so nuts. And so my students do much better on the June SAT historically than May, just because they have a little bit of breathing room. That being said, it's good to take May and June because May is the first one, it's a practice round, and then June often goes a lot better. I mentioned that for many high-performing students, summer is one of the best times. What I'll be doing a lot of this summer is high-scoring SAT sophomores, so rising juniors, and that'll bring us into a conversation about PSAT national merit in a moment. Aim to finish testing in a perfect world in advance of early application deadlines, if at all possible. So plan out a couple. And register early. There's certain places where the test centers fill up very fast. So the main reason you want to register early at act.org is to get a testing center close to you and just make sure you're booked and don't have to travel. Some scholarship programs will take later test dates than those like July, September ones. And I mentioned this, but I know probably every teacher ever has told you this. And I know I heard it a lot and I ignored it a lot. But for this test, cramming is really not effective. This is not your typical test. You have to prepare for it over the course of weeks and months, doing a little bit of work each day or every other day, or every few days even, to keep it fresh. But this is not a test where you can just sit down and say, all right, I'm going to learn the SAT tonight and go take it tomorrow. Because you really have to understand the nuances of like ACT writers. How are they thinking? What types of questions am I going to see? What's my strategy in each spot? You got to build mental stamina, because it's a 3-hour test. So it's just not like things we see normally in school. Cramming is not an effective method of preparing. So every student is different. Definitely true. This is why I still enjoy my job after many, many years, is that I teach the same thing essentially, but everyone's different. Applerouth offers academic tutoring. We do so in-school stuff, test prep, and then executive function coaching. You can see a number there. This is also, we're in our June promo. And so this is when a lot of people buy hours. I'll go to that for a second. You can get, I want to say it's at least a free hour for every 10 purchased. You can save up to $1,500 on a test prep package. Generally, coming back here for a second, the private tutoring that I do is usually 10 or 20-hour packages, occasionally a 30-hour one. You reach out to Applerouth and say, I'm looking for this, and we've got this amazing client services team, most of whom are tutors. The people who make the tests, and I'm going to just brag on Applerouth for a bit, even though I'm just a tutor now, because the instructional design team is phenomenal. So this is new, the self-prep, self-paced online course. It's a relatively new thing. I was skeptical. It's incredible. They have exercises, videos, quizzes, and they're interactive, and you can dig in as much or as little as you want to certain things. We do group classes, both in person, where we have offices like Atlanta, Seattle, et cetera, but also online. And those are broken up nicely. They're usually 2.5-hour classes, sometimes a little bit less, a little bit more. And I've done a few of those in the past year. And then, yeah, the bread and butter for Applerouth and for what I do is just the private tutoring one-on-one. Via Zoom, I found it to be really easy because we just share screens like this, get a new link for each session reports after. So I'll pull this up again just so you guys see it. And we've got 6-7 minutes to answer some questions. So I know I had one about PSAT, which I want to answer, but please feel free to head out if you are satisfied. Thank you for joining today. And yeah, let's take about 5 minutes or so to answer some questions. All right, so the first one's about merit scholars, and it's kind of tangentially ACT related. So the merit scholarships, when we're talking about the national merit scholarship competition, that has to do with the PSAT for 11th graders. So junior year in October for almost everyone, you're going to take a PSAT on a Wednesday. Sophomores do it too, but it doesn't count. So the PSAT for juniors is the only test that has an impact on merit scholarships, national merit scholarships. That is something that the 0.001 of students can get. So it's like really almost acing the PSAT. Definitely possible if you're already a high scorer, but for most people, the PSAT on a Wednesday in October is not important. You can get merit-based scholarships much, much bigger and much, much more likely to get merit-based scholarships from your SAT or ACT score. So like I was a national merit scholar. I got a $2,500 scholarship. It was a great feather in the cap, but I mean, the SAT scores and ACT scores I got are what got me the 3/4 scholarships and merit-based ones where you're going to actually improve the portfolio of the college you're attending. They want to bring you on campus. So that helps. Another one. So if we have an ACT playing with the essay, okay, so I didn't talk about essay. The ACT writing portion is almost extinct, but not quite. The essays are always 3 different perspectives. And then your job as the test taker would be you've got like 45 minutes and you have to just write as much as you can to either form your own perspective based on those 3 or agree with one or disagree, but you basically have to indirectly address these 3 perspectives and develop your own opinion. It's kind of a hard essay. There are only about 5 or 6 colleges or universities that require it now, and I had never really heard of any of them. So most colleges now are not really prioritizing ACT writing. I'm finally comfortable to say you don't have to take it. But if they are taking it, I would say just encourage the person taking that to not sweat too much about the writing portion or the score that it gets. It's not impacting the 36 in that composite. So I just wouldn't sweat the essay all that much. All right, I think maybe last one here. Yeah, so we'll go 2 more. So which ACT tests are returned with answers? It was April, June, December every year. Yeah, good question. And when you register for April, June, or December, order what's called the Test Information Release, TIR. SAT has an equivalent version for March, May, October, but ACT is April, June, December. And yeah, it usually comes back hard copy in a little bit over a month. But yeah, it's a very nice thing, nice resource. And then, okay, last question is list of colleges. I really don't remember it, but if you reach out to Applerouth, I'm sure someone can provide it. Also, if you even just put in Google ACT writing portion requirement, you'll probably see that list of 5 or 6 schools. And it's fairly obscure colleges and universities. All right, I think we've got all the questions. No problem. Thank you guys for joining. It's been fun. Enjoy the rest of your evening.